So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Spreng because he's going to take you on that journey and say, there's some good news here, the stopping and the pausing, use your lived experience, but there's a real world element to it, and I think this is a nice juncture to kind of turn it over to Nathan. Okay.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Spreng. I'm a professor of neurology and neurosurgery at McGill University. I'm a trained psychologist, and I do neuroscience work looking at changes in brain and behavior across the lifespan and learning how to understand what the signals are that transition the aging process to a more pathological cascade. So like, how can we tell the difference between healthy aging and dementia? And really trying to understand those complex dynamics that are occurring in later life development. So I'm very grateful to be here. I really appreciate Shannon's invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to share science with non-scientists, because we talk all the time, and it takes extra work for us to figure out how to communicate it in a way where it can make a difference. And so this venue, I think this is very special because I feel like there's people who have some decisional authority, and hopefully we can bring the science to bear to help inform things moving forward. So I also appreciate David so much for just like really excellent work on the Marketplace edition on brains and losses. It's pretty much, the science behind that is 100%. Like, it's phenomenally well researched and extremely accessible. So I'm very grateful, again, to have this broader audience to communicate the kind of work that we're doing. So I'm going to jump in here and talk about some other elements of aging. And this is part of the normal, healthy aging process. And I'm going to try to communicate this in the clearest way that I can. You're going to learn a little bit of neuroanatomy, but I don't want to burden you. So first off, there's a poorly named theory, which is hard to say, but it's called Socioemotional selectivity theory. And this actually is this idea that as we get older, as we get closer to our end of life, our goals and our priorities start to change. And as a consequence of that, of having a real understanding that we have these time horizons and our time is not infinite anymore, we change our priorities and we start to focus on our family and the people near us, and we value that sense of connection and the positive experiences that you can share with others. So younger adults have other kinds of goals. There are these striving goals to go and make a mark in the world and go do something. This is why young people do crazy things like go to medical school, which just seems like such a horrible and painful process that goes through years of their life where they're nearly totally disconnected from anyone else but their work. You're not going to get a 70-year-old who would do this. I mean, there's just very different priorities. So you have a tolerance for the negative elements in order to reach goals when you're young, but as you get older, you value those social connections more and you reprioritize. And so there's this shift, actually, in the way that older adults process information. And there's this, what they're calling a biasing towards the positive. And this affects many aspects of cognition, including attention and memory. So when we have younger adults come into the lab and older adults, and we give them memory tests for emotional information, so we'll show people groups of photographs, like photographs of puppies, photographs of a chair, and a photograph of a snake. And what you see is that younger adults, they remember the snake better than anything else. It's a little bit scary, it's a little aversive. Older adults will tend to remember the puppies a little bit more. There's just more allocation of attention to the positive and less attention to the negative. And this actually contributes and is part of this broader strategy of this positivity bias, or you could say there's a negativity bias in the young, but in pursuing more of this positivity, this leads to an overall increase in well-being. So I think for most people, aside from some of the physical changes that can impede us as we get older, most people wouldn't really want to go back to their younger self because of just the anxiety and some of the depression that occurs, like when you're in this orientation of striving. And as we shift towards these positive goals, And it improves well-being overall. So in general, there's like lower levels of anxiety as we get older, and over the lifespan, there's higher levels of happiness, with a slight dip when you have young children. So all of this leads to is just an overall sense of well-being, and there's a discounting of negative information, and there's an emphasis on the positive. So the thing with this is that potentially results in a certain blind spot as we get older that can render some older adults more vulnerable to exploitation, because there might be this reduction in the attention to the negative. So I have this prevalence study posted because this is my entry into trying to understand vulnerability to financial exploitation. So I've been studying aging for a number of years, and I was introduced to this idea of elder abuse by Carl Pillemer and Mark Locks. And what really struck me, and we've talked about this today already, is the prevalence of elder exploitation, but also attributes of the perpetrator, where more than 50% of cases are by a known other. It's often someone in the family. And what this suggested to me is that it wasn't just a change in cognition, but it was a change in how older adults navigate the social world. And this is one of the most complex environments that we ever have to navigate in our life, is like how do you, because social relationships are so complicated and ever changing, and they can change very rapidly. And so navigating that landscape brings a certain level of complexity, and I think this is where, at times, an older adult can be rendered more vulnerable because they cannot necessarily navigate the space optimally. And part of that might be because of the biases that are occurring. And as was mentioned, older adults are more trusting. And we can see this across a number of studies. Here is one example where just showing images of faces. And what we see is that the young will rate the face on the right as less trustworthy. Older adults have the same performance in terms of identifying who is trustworthy as young, but when it comes to identifying untrustworthy faces, this is where older adults don't endorse people as being negative as often. So there's just, again, this increase in positivity, but maybe reducing the sensitivity to detecting something that's untrustworthy. Now, if you scan people's brains while they're doing this kind of task, what we see is that there's a selective reduction in activation in a part of the brain called the insula. So this is a region that's a couple centimeters down below your temple. It's a part of the brain that serves to integrate a body sense with cognition. So it's a feeling of like who one is and like how our body is functioning, and leading to some interoceptive or self-awareness. And what we see is that when older adults are viewing untrustworthy faces, this part of the brain is not as active. So potentially there's this reduced signal in the presence of potentially negative information. And another excellent study conducted by Greg Simonez-Larkin, who's been doing a lot of work on older adult decision-making, we see that there's actually this differential change in activity, where if you have older adults performing a gambling task or an investment task in the brain scanner, where you see when young and old get a reward, when they get a win, you get activation of the dopamine system. Everyone feels good about getting a little reward. So there's no difference in terms of the experience of that positive emotion. But what we see is that older adults are not sensitive to the losses. So young, they feel the pain of losing a little bit of money, whereas older adults, that signal again in the insula is reduced. So the salience of loss is not as high in our older adults. So finally, part of the reason why I'm standing here today is because we've been looking at older adults who have been financially exploited. And this has been very slow, difficult work, in part because of the stigma associated with it. And it's difficult to recruit people and bring them into the lab. But through working with Adult Protective Services and local Office of Aging, in collaboration with Gary Turner, we're able to bring in 13 older adults who had been financially exploited. And we compared their brain structure and function to older adults who were same age, gender, same level of education, all of them cognitively are healthy. But what we see is a very selective reduction in the volume of the anterior insula. And this is a view of the brain. It's kind of a side view of it. And what you see there circled is this region of the insula that, again, is involved in this body sense, this gut feeling. So you were telling us earlier about how when you were on this phone call, your gut was saying, like, there's something wrong here. And this is the same feeling, this spidey sense of when you're walking around and you think maybe you'll take the alley shortcut, and you're like, maybe not. Like that feeling in your body, it's a difficult signal to interpret. I mean, all of us. I mean, we have a hard time sometimes understanding what that signal is and have it guide our behavior and to listen to it. But what we see in older adults, and particularly those who have been exploited, it seems like the volume on this signal is turned down, and there's more noise in the environment. So it's harder to integrate those sensations of potentially there's something problematic here, and to then change our behavior as a consequence of those signals. So what we see is that feeling, that spidey sense, is reduced. It goes down over the lifespan, but it seems to be specifically more impaired potentially in people who have been victims of exploitation. Now, what we know is that there are a lot of people who are vulnerable, but maybe have not yet been targeted. So that's another one of the challenges to doing this research, is to try to understand what are those features of vulnerability that occur in the natural aging course. So as Gary mentioned, there are a number of changes that occur with cognition over the lifespan. We have decreases in fluid cognitive ability. We have increases in crystallized knowledge. So these are things that are actually pretty easy to measure in the laboratory. At least we have good tools to assess them. And we know that these changes are a consequence of changes to the brain in terms of brain health and brain function, and that essentially these changes in cognition can affect how we manage our finances and how we engage in financial literacy. And age-related change can render us more vulnerable to exploitation because of the decline in cognition. However, in the course of the work that we're doing, we're trying to expand our understanding of age-related changes to the brain and behavior to really get a better sense of social capacity. And how is it that we navigate the social world? And what kind of tools do we have to assess this? I mean, this has been one of the biggest challenges, is because, as you all know through your own experience, people are very different from each other. And they're very different in terms of their own personality and their extroversion and how they choose to interact with the world and make connections. And because of the variability across people, it makes it really challenging for us as scientists to measure it. But this is what we're beginning to do in terms of assessing how we appraise social information, how do people engage in empathic understanding, as well as characterizing social connectedness and feelings of loneliness. And we know that these kind of social changes and how they are manifest in the brain and behavior are going to also point to other aspects of vulnerability to fraud and financial exploitation in terms of, again, this aspect of social navigation in the world. And both of these streams converge into potentially building a profile of who may be more vulnerable and ultimately may be exploited without sufficient protections. And then what we know is that these things are interacting across the lifespan. So this is a dynamic process where we have an interaction between changes in cognition and social capacity that we're only now beginning to understand in terms of how they manifest in the brain. So with that, I'd like to thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share.